Hey everybody, we are back this month to talk more about livestock. Now I do want to review really quickly that livestock are very different than companion animals. So when we talk about livestock, we are talking about animals who produce food. If you think of animals like donkeys and dogs and cats and horses, they have really important jobs on a farm, but they are not going to produce food. They are not livestock. So when we talk about livestock, we're focusing on those animals who produce milk and meat. Those in Iowa are mostly our cattle, pigs, sheep, and then our poultry, our chickens and our turkeys. Today we're going to focus on cattle. Now, if you saw us in second grade, you might remember looking at this picture of a cow and dragging your food through that cow's system. Cattle are ruminants, and ruminants are very different from people because their stomach has 4 compartments. So today we're going to talk a little bit more about that stomach system and focus on how that's different than a human and why is it that cattle can eat different things than we can. In Iowa, we have 99 counties, and every single county in our state raises cattle. Part of the reason for that is because we have so much corn. We have the food that cattle like to eat and that helps them grow. So we have corn because of our cattle, and we have cattle because of our corn. When we raise corn, 99% of what you see growing is field corn. And of all the field corn in Iowa, about 1/3 of that is fed to livestock. Not just cattle, but they are a big consumer of that. Humans can't digest field corn. We have to process it and break it down before we can eat it, and we're going to talk about the reason for that. Okay, today our focus is to talk a little bit more about the science of cattle, or why is it that they can eat things we cannot. So cattle, you've heard me say this word before, cattle are ruminants. And if you look at that picture there, you can see that they have 4 different compartments in their stomach. So their food, starts by going to the rumen. It moves from there into the reticulum, comes back to their mouth, is swallowed again and goes to the omasum, and finally goes through the abomasum. So they have 4 different compartments. Humans are called monogastrics. That prefix mono, M-O-N-O, means one, and a gastric has to do with your stomach. So we are monogastrics, one simple stomach. And on the right, you can see a diagram of some of our internal organs. And when they point to the stomach, that's all there is. The only thing we've got in common is both monogastrics and ruminants do have an intestines. They function similarly, but our food is just going through one part of the stomach to be digested. Okay, the big reason for that has to do with what is called cellulose, and that is something found in plants. So when you eat something, your stomach produces stomach acid, and that breaks down your food. There are also bacteria in your stomach, but there's not as many of them as we're going to find in a reticulum. In a ruminant, in their rumen. Ruminants also have stomach acid, but it's in their abomasum, the smallest part of their stomach, and it's actually the last place their food goes. So their food goes through a lot of processes before it reaches that stomach acid. Their food ferments more. So that means that their body can take out more of the energy, and that would be from plants. We do eat plants. Obviously, you eat vegetables. But we can't eat the same kinds of plants. We can't eat grass and we can't eat field corn because our body can't digest it in the same way. If you look at the last point, it says humans cannot digest cellulose because we don't ferment our food as much. So when we talk about field corn and grass, those things are both high in cellulose, and our bodies can't digest that. So we can't eat grass. I know you've maybe eaten a handful as a joke, but if you ate as much as a cow ate, you'd get really, really sick. It's the same reason we can't eat field corn unless it's been processed. So we can use field corn to make other things like corn syrup. We can use the starch out of it. We can use the protein, but we can't just eat it the same way cattle do. Those 4 compartments that we're going to talk a little more about are right there in this diagram. And so it is one stomach. You can see that it's, just one part like ours, but it's broken up. Ours does not have those different sections. If you look at this picture, you can see that there's no tissue between those parts. They're not broken apart as separate pieces, but it's one stomach with different compartments that have different functions. So next we're going to look at some of the ways those different parts work together. What we have here is something we never got to bring to your classroom because this guy is really heavy and really big. But we have a realistic model of a cow. I don't want to take his tail off, okay? Her tail, it looks like. But we have this model of a cow, and there's part of it laying down here. I don't want to break it, okay? Where you can see what those organs would look like inside a cow. Okay, we've got the heart up there at the top. But we're going to leave that part down, and we're going to focus just on this ruminant stomach system. So if you remember from second grade, or if you've just gathered this hearing us now, there's 4 different parts, but this stomach is one piece. It just has those different compartments, okay? They're not broken apart. There's no tissue between them, but they all have a different function. Now, this is something we'll come back to when we talk about sheep. They have this same stomach, but let's focus on how this stomach works a little bit. So when cattle eat, they're going to swallow, and that food is going to start by going to the rumen, which is this big part that looks kind of yellow back here. The rumen is the largest part of the stomach, and it's full of little bacteria. So those bacteria start to break down that food, and it starts that process of fermenting that we talked about. From there, it's going to move down to the reticulum. Okay, so the reticulum is close again to their esophagus where they swallow. And the reticulum is kind of like, there's little edges to it. We can't see this. It would be the inside of it. It's got rougher edges, and it breaks that food into small pieces we call cud. What happens to cud?
What happens to cud is it comes back up. They regurgitate that, and they chew on that. So sometimes you'll see cows or goats or llamas all chewing their cud all day. Okay, so that's that food, that regurgitated food, and then they're going to swallow that back down.
Okay, so once they swallow that cud, again, it flows back through their stomach, but this time it goes to the omasum. Okay, so that's that kind of big bulge. It almost looks like the letter O. The omasum absorbs a lot of water and nutrients. Once it's done there, the final stage is the abomasum. Okay, now that is the closest to our stomach. We told you that our stomach produces stomach acid to digest food. Cattle do also, but only in the abomasum. So sometimes that's called the true stomach because it's the most like ours. It's the only part where there's stomach acid. So any food that hasn't fermented, it hasn't broken down quite yet, will go through that acid to finally be broken down, and then it goes through the intestines and comes out as manure. And again, that can be used to fertilize corn. So we talk about cattle and corn. They're like one continuous cycle. So you can see that that stomach is much different than ours, a lot more jobs. And this is also part of what keeps cattle warm. When you see them living outside in Iowa all winter, it gives off a lot of heat and takes energy to digest food. So when they're doing that, it keeps them very warm, plus that layer of leather that they've got with their hide. Now, you should be familiar with a Venn diagram. We're going to compare 2 things. So our large circles on the outside talk about how things are different. And in the center, we look at how 2 things are alike. We are going to compare and contrast ruminants, so 4 parts to a stomach, and monogastrics, people. So what we would like you to do is you're going to make a list in each part of your diagram. What are things only ruminants can eat? What are things only monogastrics, only humans, can eat? And in the center, see if you can brainstorm the few things that both of us can eat and drink. We'll come back and check in with you. But take a few minutes as a class or however your teacher gives those directions to fill in that Venn diagram. You had a chance to fill in your Venn diagram, and it might have been tricky to come up in the middle with things that both humans and cattle can eat, so both ruminants and monogastrics. But I think when you hear them, you'll be like, oh, of course. So remember I said at the end, things you can eat or drink. So if we look, I'm going to cover the middle. Let's start with things that ruminants eat that we cannot. Ruminants can eat grass and hay. We cannot. There's way too much cellulose. We can't digest it. You might think I'm leaving some things out, but we'll come back to it. We can eat things like apples. We can eat meat, which ruminants do not eat. We can eat pasta and chips. We can eat ice cream. The list could be so long. We could make a list as high as the ceiling in your classroom. But in common, there are 4 things that both ruminants and monogastrics can eat and drink. So when we drink milk, we are drinking cow's milk, just like cattle do when they are calves, when they're babies. So we both drink the same milk. We both drink water. Now, field corn and soybeans. We don't eat field corn in the same way cattle do. We don't eat silage. We don't eat cornmeal that hasn't been processed. But when field corn is processed and broken down, there is field corn in a lot of things you eat. There's corn syrup, there's corn oil, corn starch, and those are in like 4,000 products that you're using. Soybeans are the same way. You can eat soybeans raw. They're called edamame if they're in that stage of their life. But you also find soy in a lot of things. Things that make sense, like soy sauce, but also things you might not think of, like salad dressing or oil that's used to fry French fries. We eat a lot of soybean oil. So even though our stomachs work very differently, there's a few things we have in common. But really, you looked at that stomach and you can see how different we are. And so that cellulose in those plants is really the main reason that their diet is so different from our own. I want you to keep this in mind. Our next video will be about sheep and goats and llamas have this ruminant system also. They have this same stomach that we just looked at with our cows.